Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for coming here to be participants in our 20th Nuclear Triad Symposium, sponsored by the Mitchell Institute of Aerospace Studies and the Cyber Innovation Center and Louisiana Tech Research Institute. The title of our symposium this year is Second to None, Working Together to Modernize America's Nuclear Deterrent. I'm very happy today to introduce a colleague of mine here at the Louisiana Tech, at the Mitchell Institute is Mark Gunzinger. He's our Director of Future Concepts and Capability Assessments. His discussion topic is Hypersonic Technology, Strategic Bombers, and Nuclear Weapons Resetting Deterrence. He's a retired Air Force colonel and command pilot with 3,000 hours in the B-52. And after retiring from the Air Force, he's served in multiple strategic planning positions, including Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Forces Transformation and Resources. He was Principal Director of DoD's Central Staff for the 2006 Quadrennial Defense Review and Director for Defense Transformation, Force Planning, and Resources at the National Security Council staff. Mark, I want to thank you for joining us today. And after your remarks, I'll have a few questions for you, which we have discussed. So over to you, sir, and thank you again on behalf of our sponsors and our collaborators for joining us here today.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. As my slides come up, I'd like to say thank you to our sponsors as well. This is a very timely event considering the debate over triad modernization programs. Slide, please. So I want to start with a simple graphic that illustrates a major issue with the air-breathing leg of today's triad. It's old. Every weapon system on this slide, except for the B-2, was designed to operate in threat environments of the past. Of course, that applies to the Minuteman III, but I'm going to focus my remarks on the air-breathing leg, the bomber force. Now, my old jet, the B-52, was designed back in the 1950s to be a high-altitude penetrating aircraft. And it's now a standoff attack aircraft that can't survive in modern threat environments. And the same is true for the B-1, although it's now a conventional strike-only aircraft. But similarly, Alcoms carried by B-52s are subsonic, long-range cruise missiles that were designed in the late 1970s to penetrate Soviet-era defenses. And first fielded in 1982, they had a projected service life of about 10 years. Now, because the Air Force was concerned over the Alcoms' future survivability, it began a program to replace them shortly after they became operational. And the resulting advanced cruise missile had stealth coatings, forward-swept wings, and other design features needed to penetrate increasingly advanced Soviet air defenses. However, due to the end of the Cold War, and for other reasons, DoD terminated the ACM's production early, did not replace the Air Force's Alcoms, and then eventually retired all ACMs. Slide, please. So here's another issue. The bomber force is simply too small. And it's well known that the force is now the smallest as well as the oldest that the Air Force has ever operated. There are 158 total bombers in the inventory, which is down from about 411 tails at the end of the Cold War. And even the Congress is concerned with the diminished size of the force. And the fiscal year 2021 NDAA, if passed, will establish a floor for the bomber inventory. Now, the Air Force has said it needs a future force of at least 225 total bombers to meet all of its operational requirements, including its conventional mission needs. And other studies have recommended a future force that falls somewhere between 225 and the green line at the top of this chart. The good news is the B-21 stealth bombers will begin to join the force in a few years as they become fully operational and will eventually replace B-1s and the B-2s. Next slide. So how do we get in this situation? Well, I had mentioned the advanced cruise missile 2 slides ago because it's a good example of a series of DoD decisions to defer modernizing the triad over the last 30 years. DoD has cut the size of its bomber force and triad modernization programs multiple times since the Cold War, in part to free up resources for its other priorities. And in addition to the advanced cruise missile, a former SecDef decided to end B-2 acquisition at 21 aircraft instead of buying the Air Force's required force of 132 stealth bombers. And a Secretary of Defense also canceled the Next Generation Bomber program, which preceded the B-21, as well as an earlier program to replace the Minuteman III. So, to be blunt, Triad modernization has been seen by leaders inside DoD, in OMB, as well as on the Hill, as a bill payer for years. And now we're hearing similar calls to cut spending on multiple Triad modernization programs for exactly the same reasons we've heard in the past. But one thing that is very different today is that Triad modernization, including modernization of the air-breathing leg, cannot be further delayed, even for just a couple of years, without jeopardizing its viability. Next slide. So I'd like to look at a couple other challenges to the air-breathing leg of the Triad. Now, today, the nation's total force of long-range penetrating strike aircraft consists of 20 nuclear and conventional capable stealth B-2s. Only B-2s and B-21s, when they join the force, will have the stealth technologies, computing power, and mission systems needed to penetrate areas defended by advanced integrated air defenses fielded by Russia and China. As shown on this little graphic, penetrating bombers can launch conventional and nuclear standoff and direct attack weapons, including gravity bombs, on targets, while non-stealth B-52s must stand off outside the range of an IADS to launch their weapons. And that can result in some operational limitations, which I'll talk about next. Before leaving this slide, I'd like to foot stomp one more point, which is advanced air defenses are also increasingly capable against individual weapons, such as legacy cruise missiles, including the Alchem, not just non-stealth aircraft. Next slide. So in addition to survivability concerns, the changing nature of potential target sets is another reason why the Air Force must modernize and grow the size of its bomber force to meet its future requirements. First, conventional target sets in the war against China or Russia may be far larger and more highly distributed than the 40,000 aim points attacked during the Desert Storm air campaign against Iraq almost 20 years ago, almost 30 years ago now. In fact, during a conflict with a peer aggressor, the Air Force could be required to attack more aim points than it targeted during all of its air campaigns combined since the end of the Cold War. So this illustration on the slide uses a notional target set developed from unclassified sources, and each of those little red circles denotes a clump of potential aim points to illustrate that point. Second, adversaries are using mobility, hardening, deeply burying, camouflage, and other active and passive countermeasures to degrade the effectiveness of U.S. precision strikes, including nuclear attacks. So this is a good point to make a couple comments about why the Air Force and Secretary of Defense Gates decided to procure a new penetrating B-21 instead of a standoff bomber. As this graphic shows, penetrating bombers with a B-2-like combat radius of somewhere between 2,500 to 3,000 nautical miles and carrying short-range weapons can reach any target on the face of the earth. Plus, penetrating bombers can attack from multiple aspects, which complicates an enemy's defensive operations. Next slide. In contrast, the number of targets that can be reached by standoff weapons depend on their range and how close their launching aircraft can approach contested areas. And that's what this slide shows. On the left side, you see a B-52 that carries a JASSM-ER-like weapons that have a range greater than 500 nautical miles. And you see those weapons from that standoff range can't reach a large portion of that notional target set. On the right side, if that B-52 must stand off 800 nautical miles, you see very few, if any, targets could be struck with a weapon the range of a JASSM-ER. Next slide. Plus, as this slide shows, enemy countermeasures such as hardening, mobility, as I mentioned earlier, can also reduce the effectiveness of standoff strikes. Now, the small picture of China on the left is from the previous slide, showing the standoff B-52, and the one on the right excludes potential hardened or deeply buried targets and mobile or relocatable targets, such as missile transporter erector launchers. But broadly speaking, conventional long-range weapons can't carry warheads that are large enough to penetrate very hard and deeply buried targets. And weapons with very long flight times, such as subsonic cruise missiles that are launched hundreds of miles from target areas, may not reach their aim points for tens of minutes, which can be well outside the time needed for a mobile missile launcher and other mobile systems to change their locations. In contrast, stealth bombers can carry much larger penetrating weapons and approach targets in contested areas close enough so their weapons can reach their aim points before the targets can reposition. And that's another reason why both penetrating and standoff bombers are needed in the future force. Next slide. I'll touch on hypersonics. Now, weapons that can fly at hypersonic speeds can reduce latency in the kill chain, which can improve our military's ability to strike mobile and other time-sensitive targets. However, hypersonic weapons that must fly many hundreds of miles after launch still might arrive at their pre-programmed target coordinates after their mobile targets have changed their locations. And that's what this little graph shows. It uses a 5-minute move window for a mobile Russian SAM system like an S-300. You could do the same for a Russian or a Chinese mobile missile launcher. So even faster weapon speeds are needed to compensate for longer standoff distances. And increased speed and longer weapons range can increase the size and the cost of those weapons, which is a pretty important consideration, certainly for conventional strikes. Again, my real point here, though, is that both penetrating and standoff bombers are needed in the force, including the Triad, because the combination of bombers capable of conducting both standoff and penetrating attacks could compel peer competitors to invest in additional all-azimuth defenses, and those investments might be at the expense of buying more offensive weapon systems. Last slide. So I'm going to finish up with just a few thoughts on the LRSO, which will be replacing Outcomes around the year 2030. The Air Force has said multiple times that it needs more survivable weapons as well as survivable platforms like 5th generation combat aircraft. And that's true for the air-breathing leg of the Triad as well as the conventional force. And that's a key reason why LRSOs will not be redundant capabilities. And furthermore, not only will they maintain the B-52's ability to conduct nuclear strikes from standoff ranges, they'll also be carried by B-21s, which will expand B-21's options to strike targets while avoiding air defense threats. And in future, air-breathing leg of the Triad that has the ability to conduct both standoff and penetrating strikes is overall a more effective deterrent than a force that can only attack targets with gravity weapons. And with that, Peter, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'd like to be able to post your slides on the Cyber Innovation Center website when we post everything on the 10th of December. That would be excellent. You and I have socialized some of these questions, and let me walk you through the first one I'd like you to address. The defense budget for 2021 is currently under consideration by Congress. That runs out of money on December 11th. Then a new budget will be presented in probably late February at the best, maybe early March. Would you walk us through the needed improvements to ensure the air-breathing leg of the Triad will remain capable of performing its mission?
Sure. You know, as I mentioned earlier, all the Air Force's nuclear-capable bombers were originally designed to penetrate hostile airspace and deliver weapons on targets. Now, over time, advances in air defenses, including look-down, shoot-down radars, more advanced, longer-range, precise surface-to-air and air-to-air weapons, and other systems, have greatly increased the risk that an enemy will be able to successfully complete a kill chain against non-stealth bombers. And that's why legacy bombers, such as the B-52H, and of course the B-1B, are now considered standoff attack platforms. And I think it's safe to say that eventually the same pattern will hold true for the B-2 as it has every other bomber our nation has bought. So may I suggest a better way of thinking about that dynamic? It's really a long-term competition where competitors continually strive to develop the next generation of air defenses to offset advances in aircraft and weapon technologies. Now, the problem is, after the Cold War, our military pretty much stopped modernizing the air-breathing leg of the Triad, by which I mean it stopped fielding new bombers and the weapons they deliver. And that's not true for Russia and China. Both took advantage of DoD's strategic pause, to put it charitably, to field increasingly capable, layered, integrated air defense systems. So that's another reason why, obviously, DoD decided to build the B-21 bomber, which will have a low observable design, advanced stealth materials, sensors, information fusion systems, and smart mission planning capabilities that will, in combination, give it the ability to survive in future threat environments. The same holds true for the penetrating LRSO. So my number one priority would be build systems to replace legacy weapons that, frankly, are not survivable in terms of conducting penetrating missions, not just against Russian targets, but potentially against Chinese targets as well.
Thank you, Mark. Another question has to do with the size of the bomber force. As you have often written about, the Air Force currently is the smallest it's been in its history and closest to its oldest. I think we've made some improvements there. The bomber force is scheduled or projected, if we can build it, 225 bombers. A number of people have suggested, particularly Bill Perry, in a new book in June, called for a reduction in the bomber force, particularly that part that would be nuclear, by about 25%. What are the consequences of such a cut? Would you address that, please?
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter. Let's be frank about it. DoD has already reduced the size of its bomber force over the last 30 years, as that graph I showed demonstrated. For budgetary and other reasons, the force was cut to its present level of 158 total bombers. And in fact, the Air Force now intends to retire even more of its B-1s before B-21s join the inventory in significant numbers. So with that context, let me say that 225 bombers, the future force, the Air Force says is a minimum it requires, is just more than half the size of the force that was on the ramp at the end of the last period of great power competition. And that was the Cold War. Remember that our nation was challenged with a single peer competitor during the Cold War, the Soviet Union, while today we have to factor in China as well as Russia, both of whom also have nuclear triads. So my answer to 225 bombers, that really is a moderate to high risk force, considering the increased need for conventional long-range strike capacity for an air campaign against a peer adversary, plus the need to simultaneously maintain a robust deterrent against a nuclear armed adversary. And this just isn't my opinion or Mitchell Institute's opinion. Other think tanks have come to the same conclusion and recommended a future force somewhere between 270 and 383 total bombers, which is still less than the size of the Cold War bomber force.
Thank you, Mark. Another question. Some people have said that either a bomber has to be conventional or nuclear because of its dual use. It could be seen, even if it was just in a conventional role, it could be seen as escalatory because an adversary would not know whether or not it's nuclear armed. And that's an age-old argument that has come up. But would you address that, please?
Yes, thank you. Honestly, I think that argument is more motivated by budgetary concerns than a valid theory of the case for nuclear deterrence. I believe, as most do, that bombers carrying nuclear cruise missiles and gravity weapons are the most stabilizing leg of the U.S. triad. Bomber force is a means to send highly visible signals in a crisis to bolster our nation's deterrence posture. The Air Force can generate its bombers to alert status within a matter of hours, and if necessary, can launch them and disperse them to other locations to show our nation's resolve and increase the bomber force's survivability. And operationally, bombers can fly airborne alert sorties, which is another way to signal our nation's readiness to respond to nuclear aggression. And on missions, they also have longer flight times than ballistic missiles and can be recalled after they are launched. Again, those are capabilities that no other leg of the triad can offer. And of course, it's critically important to think of deterrence from the perspective of an adversary. And in the case of both China and Russia, neither are expressing concerns over the destabilizing potential of dual capable B-52s and B-2s, which have, of course, been in the force for decades. Furthermore, both are developing new stealth bombers, which will likely be dual capable. Russia's new bomber may be operational in the mid-2020s and can carry the nuclear-armed KH-102 stealth cruise missile, for instance.
Next question has to do with hypersonics. And we had talked about this previously, is that DoD has prioritized the development of and fielding of various variants of the ground launch, sea launched, and air launched missiles and having the hypersonic capability. Two questions. First, in the context of deterrence, do you see the development of offensive hypersonic weapons as destabilizing? And second, the U.S. cannot currently defend against hypersonic weapons. We need to first see them coming. And this, as critics say, would increase the vulnerability of our bomber air bases. What are your thoughts on the development of defenses as well as offenses, how they're going to work together?
Excellent. On your first question, hypersonic weapons is destabilizing capabilities. I don't see it that way at all. And the Mitchell Institute and other think tanks, and DoD for that matter, has written reports on next generation munitions, including air-breathing hypersonic cruise missiles and boost glide weapons. And as I mentioned during the briefing, air missile defenses fielded by Russia and China are increasingly capable against our legacy weapons, not just aircraft. But weapons that can fly at hypersonic speeds, which by definition is Mach 5 or greater, can increase their survivability in contested areas. So they are needed to help maintain our military's ability to strike any target with precision globally, despite the emergence of advanced air defenses, which are not just operated by China and Russia, but are proliferating globally. Now, I would argue that it would be destabilizing if our military failed to field hypersonic weapons, which could result in a situation where a peer adversary has significant advantages in both its ability to strike with precision and defend against U.S. precision strikes. And that brings us to your second question. It's a well-known fact that China and Russia are on the cusp or actually have operationalized some hypersonic weapons, including air-launched cruise missiles. So I think it's critical that DoD continue to invest in capabilities to track those weapons in flight and then defeat them, including defeating long-range hypersonic cruise missiles launched by bombers. Now, NORTHCOM has identified these weapons as a growing threat to the U.S. homeland. Of course, ballistic missiles also travel at hypersonic speeds, but hypersonic weapons such as boost glide systems will fly at low altitudes and be able to maneuver mid-flight. And that's going to make them harder to track than missiles that fly more predictable ballistic flight paths. So investing in new overhead persistent infrared sensor systems, possibly including a low Earth orbit constellation that can track those boost glide weapons, is going to be critical to an effective defense. And I think that defense will also need non-kinetic defenses such as directed energy weapons, as well as kinetic interceptors.
Okay.
So the bottom line, I think, in addition to fielding our own family of hypersonic weapons, developing effective defenses against hypersonic weapon attacks should be a top priority of the next administration.
My final question, Mark, is what would be the impact if the proposals that some people have made, including former Secretary of Defense Perry and others, that the long-range strike option or cruise missile should be canceled or significantly delayed as part of the nuclear triad? What would be the impact in your view?
Okay, so the very short answer is the B-52 will be out of the triad if it does not have the capability to launch effective strikes from standoff distances. I think assertions that the LRSO will be redundant capability or destabilizing weapon system, which are the two most prevalent arguments I've heard, are specious. I've already mentioned why the LRSO is not going to be redundant, because without a replacement for the Alchem, a good chunk of our bomber force will not be capable of conducting nuclear strikes into contested areas. And counters to the destabilizing assertion pretty much mirror what I said earlier about dual capable bombers. LRSOs are not use-lose weapons. Crews can launch or withhold them for launch as required. For that matter, I'm sure the LRSO will be designed so air crews can actually retarget them before they launch to meet changing requirements as necessary. Now, there's really little, if any, evidence that nuclear cruise missiles were considered to be destabilizing capabilities during the Cold War. And let's not forget, just as China and Russia are both pursuing new bombers, which will be dual capable, they're also buying dual capable air launch cruise missiles, which strongly suggests that they do not consider them to be destabilizing. China's CJ-20 long range, approximately 2,000 kilometer cruise missile will be carried by its H-6 bombers, as well as its new stealth bomber when that is fielded.
Well, Mark, thank you. We've come to the end of our session. I want to thank you on behalf of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies and the Cyber Innovation Center, as well as Louisiana Tech Research Institute, and our friends at Global Strike Command who have helped put this conference together. Again, thank you very much for your remarks. I have to say that the bomber leg of the triad often gets less attention than the sea-launched and ICBM areas, but you have made up that deficit today. And I want to thank you. We will look forward to having you again speak to us on this issue. And again, my thanks from our sponsors and our friends for an extraordinary good presentation. Thank you very much, Mark.
And thank you, Peter, and also thank you to our friends and sponsors.
Thank you, sir.